All right. My name is Garrett Kenison, and I did my presentation for men across cultures on men affected by HIV. A little bit of intro. HIV is a virus that attacks the immune system. It is spread through blood, semen, or vaginal fluids. So it is an STD, and you can get it if you come in contact with somebody's blood who has HIV. It is not the most common STD in the United States, but it is the deadliest. I believe the most common STD is HPV, and HIV is like third or fourth. But HIV is the deadliest, so HIV kills the most. If HIV is not treated, it can turn into AIDS, which is when there has been serious damage to the immune system. And AIDS is a syndrome, while HIV is a virus. So the virus can turn into a syndrome that cannot be cured. I chose this group of men because HIV disproportionately affects men, and I wanted to learn more about it. Um, Usually, you don't hear about the diseases that affect men more than women, so that's why this interested me. Who gets HIV? HIV disproportionately affects racial minorities and gay and bisexual men. So racial minorities include Latino and African American men, and as well as gay and bisexual men, it affects um, all all men on the LGBTQ spectrum. There were about 38,000 new cases of HIV in 2018, and about 70% of them were homosexual men. 24% of them were heterosexual, and 7% were individuals who injected drugs. So, as you can see, the vast majority of men that got HIV were gay. From 2014 to 2018, the rate of HIV infection actually decreased in heterosexual individuals. So, that's a good thing. But that was just heterosexuals. Homosexuals, it was the opposite. It increased. In 2018, transgender individuals accounted for less than 2% of new cases. This surprised me because usually whatever problems that gay or bisexual men have, transgenders are close behind, but transgenders aren't affected by HIV that much at all. So that surprised me. Who gets HIV? Continued. African American men who had sex with other men were the most affected subpopulation. So, yeah. And then heterosexual Caucasian women were the least affected subpopulation. As I was saying earlier, women are way less affected by HIV, and straight white women are the least affected subpopulation. By race, African Americans had the highest rate of HIV infection, while Pacific Islanders were the lowest. This was interesting to me because Pacific Islanders and like Native Americans and Asian men were less affected by HIV than white men, which is usually not the case for some things. But African American and Latino men were the most affected by HIV. In a study about Black men who had sex with other men, found that 30% of the men that had HIV in the study were actually heterosexual, even though they had sex with another man. I found this interesting because usually studies don't dive this deep. They just say gay or straight. They don't say like straight but has had sex with a man. But it is important in a study like this because they have to account for everybody who gets HIV, and that includes straight men who have had sex with another man for whatever reason. They were questioning their sexuality or they just wanted to try it. So, where in the United States do men get HIV? Men across the whole country can get HIV. It doesn't matter where you live. A man in Alaska can get HIV. A man in Florida can get HIV. A man in Minnesota can get HIV. But the South is the most affected region, while the Midwest is the least affected. I wasn't surprised to hear the South is the most affected because usually that's the poorest part of the United States and has the least access to healthcare. I was kind of surprised about the Midwest because I didn't think the Midwest was a wealthy part of the United States or had the best access to healthcare, but I think it has to do with the least amount of African American men because the Midwest is pretty white. and African American men are vastly more affected than white men by HIV. Men in urban areas are much more likely to contract HIV than their suburban or rural counterparts. This makes sense to me because there are just more people to get HIV from in urban areas. There are more men to have sex with than in rural or suburban areas. But I would think if you got HIV in an urban area, you would be better off because you would have better access to healthcare than in a rural part of the country. Some social issues of HIV. Some common stigmas that people have about HIV are that only a certain group of people can get it. So there are people that believe only gay people can get HIV, which is not true. Anybody can get HIV. And there are some people that believe that HIV was a punishment created by God or whatever for gay people, for gay men, which is not true. And it's pretty insane, but there actually are people who believe that. Discrimination of HIV positive individuals is damaging to not only the person with HIV, but to society as we try to fight this pandemic. Common ways people discriminate against HIV positive individuals are denying them healthcare, refusal to be face to face with them, and calling them offensive terms like hivers or positives. So there are people that think just talking to somebody with HIV or like HIV can spread through the air, or if you touch somebody with HIV, it's not true. You have to touch their blood and a good amount of their blood or have sex with them. People who contract HIV from drug use can be seen as homosexual, even if they are not, and be treated poorly by people who do not support homosexuality. So this I've heard of before, and I've kind of like, oh, that makes sense. So like if a straight man were to get HIV from drug injections, so like using a dirty needle, he might receive backlash from society, like if they don't agree with homosexuality, even though he's straight, and so he would have to deal with that. So healthcare of men with HIV. HIV disproportionately affects poor and minority men, so this correlates with lack of proper healthcare. A study published in 2020 found that Latino immigrants were more likely than Blacks to never have been tested for HIV. And male gender and lower healthcare knowledge were also associated with no previous HIV testing. I thought that was really interesting because men, I guess it's a societal thing where women are more aware of their health and maybe more knowledgeable of like preventative measures than men are. So even though HIV affects men more than women, women knew more about it and the testing about it. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And it was interesting, excuse me. It was interesting that this study focused on Latino immigrants and Blacks. So Latino immigrants were born outside of the United States. So that means they were less likely to have never been tested for HIV, which was, I found that interesting because maybe in other countries the education could be better about HIV, but just depends. Minority men are less likely to know about testing for HIV than white men or white women. This makes sense because white men usually correlates with more educated and wealthier, so they would understand more. And as I was talking about earlier, women are more knowledgeable about it than men are. For whatever reason, that's just an education thing, I think, or women care more about their bodies. There are a lot of medications now for HIV, and these four, Emtrivia, Epivir, Viride, and Retrovir, are specifically, they block an enzyme that HIV needs. They block an enzyme in your body that HIV needs to reproduce and spread its virus. Oh, it's switched to the next slide. Let's go back one sec. So it blocks an enzyme in your body that HIV needs to reproduce. So it will lower the effects of it and make the patient's life a lot easier. And there are some of my citations. And that's it. Thank you.